You're listening to the History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences podcast, online at hi-fi-lang-sci.net. There you can find links and references to all the literature we discuss. In the previous two episodes, we explored the intellectual background to the work of Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield. In this episode, we turn to the methods of Sapir and Bloomfield and see how they were adopted by the next generation of American linguists and turned into the doctrines of distributionalism. In their linguistic methods, both Sapir and Bloomfield took what could be described as a formalist approach to language. They both emphasize that the linguist can, and indeed should, study the formal patterns found in each language without reference to their meaning, use, or any other external factors. This formalist attitude, embraced by Sapir and Bloomfield, was in many ways a continuation of existing tendencies in linguistic scholarship, sharpened by the latest advances in the field. In his 1921 book Language, an introduction to linguistics as he conceived it, Sapir commented that he did not wish to treat language as a concrete mechanism, as it would be studied by the physiologist or the psychologist. Rather, he sought to undertake an inquiry into the function and form of the arbitrary systems of symbolism that we term languages. That is, Sapir imagined languages to be abstract entities that can be investigated without consideration of how they're actually manifested in the brains and bodies of speakers. Furthermore, Sapir held that the formal side of the arbitrary system constituted by each language operates to a large extent independently of the functions that it's called on to perform. In the arrangement of its sounds, observed Sapir, every language has an inner phonetic system of definite pattern. Although he didn't use the term phoneme in his book Language, this inner phonetic system to which he referred was nothing other than the phonology of a language as understood in phonemic theory. We talked about the development of phonemic theory back in episode 15. In addition to its inner phonetic system, every language also has a definite feeling for patterning on the level of grammatical formation. Sapir continued, both of these submerged and powerfully controlling impulses to definite form operate as such, regardless of the need for expressing particular concepts or of giving consistent external shape to particular groups of concepts. Sapir therefore saw languages not only as abstract systems, but also recognized that their formal structures, in both phonology and grammar, are shaped by their own inherent principles. In a review of Sapir's Language, Bloomfield praised Sapir for proclaiming language to be the autonomous province of the linguist, a self-sufficient object of study separate from the concerns of the physiologist or psychologist. But at the same time, he lamented Sapir's lapses in not following through on this promise. Several chapters of Sapir's book discuss the conceptual aspects of grammar, and others even address questions of how linguistic form may be connected to culture and race. But we'll remember from episode 31 that even though Sapir broached such topics, he was very cautious in his conclusions, and rejected essentializing and deterministic links between linguistic structures and patterns of thought and culture. In his own programmatic statements on linguistics, Bloomfield strove even more strenuously for the separation of form and function. One of the clearest expressions of this attitude is Bloomfield's 1926 paper, A Set of Postulates for the Science of Language, which was an attempt to offer a succinct set of axioms defining the fundamental principles and methods of linguistics as a science. We discussed this paper in the previous episode as one of the earliest expressions of Bloomfield's behaviorism. In his postulates, Bloomfield defined a language as the totality of utterances that can be made in a speech community. Studying a language therefore amounts to capturing the total range of utterances that can be made in that language. Every linguistic form has a meaning, and every meaning corresponds to a form. But, wrote Bloomfield, the utterance is made up wholly of forms. That's to say, the object of investigation proper to linguistics are the forms that make up utterances, of which the language is in turn comprised. The basic unit of form in Bloomfield's scheme was the morpheme. He defined it as a recurrent meaningful form which in turn cannot be analyzed into smaller recurrent meaningful forms. Morpheme was an existing linguistic term. It had been introduced by Jan Baudouin de Courtenay in the 1880s as part of the study of alternations, which gave rise to modern phonemic theory. Baudouin's morpheme was similarly the minimal meaning-bearing part of a word. One level lower, Bloomfield's morphemes are made up of phonemes, the distinctive sounds which serve to distinguish one morpheme from another, but which bear no meanings themselves. This distinction between meaning-bearing morphemes and meaningless phonemes is the same as that later captured by the notion of double articulation or the duality of patterning, which we discussed in the context of Karl Bühler's work back in episode 21. On Bloomfield's analysis, linguists can therefore decompose linguistic forms to a point where meaning is absent, but they have no methods to reduce meaning to a level where form plays no role. For this reason, argued Bloomfield, it makes sense for linguists to pursue an approach to the study of language that takes form as the starting point. The general contours of Sapir and Bloomfield's formalism should be fairly familiar to us by this point. Neo-grammarian historical comparative linguistics of the late 19th century had already taken a formalist turn in its methods and rhetoric. As we commented in episode 10, it was the neo-grammarians' obsession with treating linguistic forms, with their various alternations and diachronic transmutations, as autonomous objects of study that constituted the positivism in linguistics that was decried by Karl Fossler. Neo-grammarian positivism was formalist in the sense in which we use the term here, although the neo-grammarians gestured towards physiological forces as the driver of sound change, and psychological processes as producing counteracting analogies. These causal factors were thought to lie outside linguistics proper. The task of the neo-grammarian linguist was simply to observe the changes in forms, and devise rules describing them. Both Sapir and Bloomfield began their university studies in Germanic philology, and were inducted into Indo-European linguistics, which in their student days was dominated by neo-grammarian doctrine, with its formalist bent. After completing his master's in German, Sapir moved into Boasian linguistic anthropology as a graduate student. However, Sapir always maintained an interest in historical comparative research, and applied its methods to the American context. Indeed, Sapir's continued allegiance to historical comparative research became a point of friction between him and Boas. In the absence of ancient written records, Boas believed that historical reconstructions in American languages were irredeemably speculative. Sapir, for his part, felt that Boas simply lacked the relevant linguistic training and didn't understand the methods. Bloomfield was more deeply rooted in Indo-European tradition than Sapir, and stayed longer in the fold. Bloomfield had a family connection to historical linguistics. His uncle, Maurice Bloomfield, was a noted Sanskritist and Indo-Europeanist who had been a student of William Dwight Whitney. Bloomfield wrote his doctoral dissertation on a topic in Germanic historical linguistics, and his first university appointments were as a German language instructor and professor of comparative philology. It was only after he was ensconced in a professorial chair that Bloomfield turned his attention to the synchronic description of non-Indo-European languages, in particular the Austronesian language Tagalog and American indigenous languages. Bloomfield also had a personal connection to the neo-grammarians. In order to be promoted from language instructor to assistant professor at the University of Illinois, he had to prove that he had studied with the greats of his field in Germany. In the academic year 1913 to 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, Bloomfield traveled to Germany to receive instruction from the aging founders of the neo-grammarian movement at the universities of Leipzig and Göttingen. Bloomfield is perhaps the last leading American linguist who was obliged to make such a pilgrimage in aid of career advancement. In subsequent generations, a homegrown American education was sufficient for most to make a career in linguistics. And after World War II, an American PhD soon became the gold standard in research qualifications, attracting students from around the world who could expect to go on to illustrious careers in America and internationally. The earliest stirrings of structuralism only served to accentuate the formalist attitude to language, and Sapir and Bloomfield were caught up in the structuralist wave as it swept across the Atlantic from Europe. The 1916 course in general linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, often cited as the founding document of structuralism, as we discussed back in episode 12, wove formalism into the very fabric of the theory. A key motivation for Saussure in putting forward the notion of la langue was to fashion a distinct object of study for linguistics that demarcated it from psychology and other sciences, such as anthropology, traditional normative grammar, philology, and so on. Saussure's langue is the abstract synchronic system that constitutes each language, considered independently of its use in la parole. While language undeniably has a mental and social basis, the abstraction of la langue allows the linguist to study language on its own terms, without becoming entangled in these heterogeneous factors. Saussure commented, "Among so many dualities, language, that is, la langue, alone seems to lend itself to independent definition and provide a fulcrum that satisfies the mind." When we introduced Sapir's views at the beginning of this episode, we found that his formalism in language was similarly directed towards a demarcation of linguistics from other sciences. In his review of Sapir's book, Bloomfield cited Saussure's course as, quote, giving a theoretic foundation to the newer trend of linguistic study. But Sapir and Bloomfield's respective turns to formalism were more than just a continuation of existing disciplinary trends. As the historian of linguistics Jean-Michel Fortis argued in his 2019 paper on Sapir's notion of form/pattern and its aesthetic background, Sapir's understanding of linguistic form owed much to aesthetic theory, as outlined by Benedetto Croce and contemporary art theorists. Croce was an Italian philosopher and interpreter of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who Karl Fossler cited as an influence on his own idealism in linguistics. Sapir's debt to scholarship in aesthetics is visible in the way that he conceived of patterns in language as being created by an innate striving for formal elaboration and expression, as he wrote in a 1924 essay, The Grammarian and His Language. According to Sapir, language structure is not the accidental result of accumulated usage, but rather the deliberate product of a drive for formal arrangement. Jean-Michel Fortis has demonstrated that this notion of a form drive has deep roots in German art theory. In contrast to Sapir's humanistic approach to linguistic form, Bloomfield took a hard-nosed scientistic stance, which was tied to his commitments to the psychological school of behaviorism, which we sketched in the previous episode. So we see that Sapir and Bloomfield, the leading figures of American linguistics in the interwar years, converged on the position that every language exhibits formal structures which operate independently of any external factors. This formal layer of language is the exclusive domain of the linguist, one of whose core tasks is to isolate and describe these forms. Sapir and Bloomfield laid the theoretical and technical groundwork for this task, but its elaboration was the work of the next generation. The principles of linguistic analysis this generation set down are generally known as distributionalism. In its ideal formulations, distributionalism is an inductive approach that involves scanning a corpus of linguistic data in order to discover the recurring formal patterns in a language. This approach represents the methods practiced and taught by Sapir, and in particular, Bloomfield, distilled to their essence. The principles of distributionalism were progressively articulated in papers and books produced in the 1930s and 40s. The 1934 paper, The Phonemic Principle by Maurice Swadesh was intended to synthesize existing discussions of phonemic analysis and provide a complete account in one place. Swadesh stated that he was, quote, most directly indebted to Professor Sapir as my teacher for my understanding of the phonemic principle. But he cited also Bloomfield's Language as a source, alongside papers published in the House Journal of the Prague Linguistic Circle. One of the major contributions of Swadesh's 1934 paper was to introduce the term complementary distribution, a name for one of the key insights in forming the notion of the phoneme and a central concept of distributionalism. We've already become acquainted with complementary distribution without using the term. It's the principle that the variant realizations of a phoneme, the allophones of a phoneme, will never appear in the same phonological environment and will therefore never contrast with one another to distinguish words. We'll recall from episode 15 that we illustrated this principle with aspirated and unaspirated voiceless stops in English. These will never appear in the same environment. For example, if we were to analyze a corpus of English speech data, we would find that the aspirated p in park will never appear after s at the beginning of a word. This is the environment of the unaspirated variant p, as in spark. These two allophones, p and p, are in complementary distribution. The further development of distributionalism is largely a story of extending the techniques of phonemic analysis to other parts of grammatical description. A milestone along this route is the 1942 paper Morpheme Alternance in Linguistic Analysis by Zelig-Harris. Harris's explicit aim in this paper was to put forward, quote, a technique for determining the morphemes of a language as rigorous as the method used now for finding its phonemes. To this end, he made morphemes into units structurally parallel to phonemes. Just as a phoneme is made up of allophones in complementary distribution, a morpheme unit, wrote Harris, is a group of one or more alternants which have the same meaning and complementary distribution. The striving for greater formal rigor led some members of the younger generation to voice mild criticism of their masters. In the 1948 paper, A Set of Postulates for Phonemic Analysis, whose title and structure was explicitly modelled on Bloomfield's 1926 A Set of Postulates for a Science of Language, the linguist Bernard Bloch expressed dissatisfaction with Bloomfield's continued appeal to meaning in his phonemic analyses. Bloch wrote, Bloomfield invokes meaning as a fundamental criterion and arrives at his definition of the phoneme without stating in detail the intermediate assumptions that lead to it. Bloch, by contrast, sought to avoid all semantic and psychological criteria, even though meaning can be a useful shortcut in the investigation of phonemic structure. American linguistics, increasingly dominated by the nascent doctrine of distributionalism, received unprecedented institutional support in World War II. American soldiers were being sent to the furthest reaches of the globe, where they needed to be able to communicate with the local inhabitants, both as allies and enemies. Investment in foreign language training became a priority for the US government. The intensive language program, organized by the American Council of Learned Societies, was just one initiative that provided an opportunity for linguists to apply their skills to the task of foreign language training. Under the auspices of this program, Bloomfield wrote the 1942 Outline Guide for the Practical Study of Foreign Languages, which was essentially a manual on field linguistics. The book guides the reader through the elicitation and analysis of a language with a native speaker informant. The 1942 Outline of Linguistic Analysis by Bernard Bloch and George Trager was a companion volume focusing on the technical details of linguistic analysis. The intensive language program also produced numerous textbooks on specific foreign languages. Bloomfield contributed books on Dutch and Russian. Support for language research during the war was so sumptuous that the American linguist Charles Hockett later commented that he felt like a war millionaire, like a profiteer whose business had benefited unreasonably from the misery of the war. While other young men and women risked their lives fighting on the front, Hockett and his colleagues were able to devote themselves to their scientific passions in safety and comfort. Now the dominant doctrine in an ascendant discipline, distributionalism received its grand formulation a few years after the war, in Zelig Harris's 1951 book, Methods in Structural Linguistics. The exclusive focus on formal distribution as the basis of linguistic analysis is set out plainly in the opening pages of this book. Harris wrote, "It is of course possible to study various relations among parts or features of speech, e.g. similarities or other relations in sound or in meaning, or genetic relations in the history of the language. The main research of descriptive linguistics, and the only relation which will be accepted as relevant in the present survey, is the distribution or arrangement within the flow of speech of some parts or features relatively to others." The manuscript of Harris's 1951 Methods was proofread by one of his gifted students, a young Noam Chomsky. Famously, in the 1950s, Chomsky rebelled against the strictures of the uncompromisingly empiricist methods that had become the default doctrines of American linguistics. In his own theory of generative grammar, Chomsky reopened fundamental questions on the nature of language and its study, and thereby helped to instigate the cognitive revolution of the late 1950s. With repercussions felt across the human sciences, the cognitive revolution hailed a retreat from behaviorist dogma and turned scholars' attention once again to the workings of the human mind. But this is the story of linguistics and the human sciences in the post-war era, which we'll take up in later episodes.